So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same events happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after wind. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will be master of all which I toiled, and I used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also, I saw, is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after wind. Thanks. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. To you moms out there, if your experience with your children was like ours, you'll quickly probably remember one of the first words that your kids learn, especially once they enter that toddler phase where they can start to put sentences together and you can start to converse, and it's not just no. They learn that word really fast, well, at least mine did. And but one of the questions that they ask you that can be exasperating, moms, right, is the word why. Why? Hey, don't touch the stove. Why? Well, because you'll burn yourself. Why? Well, because there's fire. Well, why? And you're like, I don't have time to explain combustion and gas and ignition and just don't touch it. All the why questions. Why? And it's great that they are curious in their minds. Some people never lose their intellectual curiosity. That's probably a good thing. To not just wonder how, but why. And we are continuing in our series at Ecclesiastes. And after the short break that we had last week, I was preaching at a church plant in Ontario. And you guys had Jerry here throwing me under the bus. I wanted to include... I was trying to find a verse in Isaiah to use today just so I could say it, but I just did it, so we'll just leave it at that. So my next series is going to be Isaiah, and we're going to just wear that thing out. But Solomon, or the writer, the preacher, as we're told here, Kohelet, the preacher who we're learning from, probably Solomon, or certainly maybe his ghostwriter, or somebody that is really meant to be him. I think it's probably Solomon that we're meant to be learning from here, is asking these why questions. He's asking, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? Where will I find satisfaction for the deep recesses of my soul? And if you remember from the last couple of weeks, he sets out on this experiment, essentially, to try to see what will actually fulfill him, Where will he find his purpose? Where will he find his meaning? Where will he find satisfaction? And he has all the resources available to him. He's king. He's got wisdom, God-given wisdom, so much so that the other kings of the world are traveling, kings and queens of the world are traveling to him. And there's nothing he can't answer. He has all the riches that he could need, all the power that he needs. He can do, the scripture tells us, right? He said no. He never said no to anything that his heart wanted during this time. And so he goes exploring. And last week we looked at the vanity, really, of pleasure. And that's probably a good thing for us to think about, especially where we live here in Orange County. But he's going to turn and he's going to look at this idea of wisdom. And so we're going to look at this morning a couple areas of vanity as we finish this chapter. And we're going to look at the vanity of wisdom and of work. And if that, the word vanity, we said, comes from the word hevel, which is like smoke or vapor. It often gets translated meaningless. Not that it doesn't have meaning, but that the meaning is hard to grasp. Life is it's enigmatic. It's hard to wrap your hands around. It's like a vapor. It's your breath on a cold morning. It's there, you can see it, and then it's gone before you can hang on to it and capture it. And he says this is what life is like. He's trying to figure it out, and he says, but life often it feels like vanity. It's this vapor. It's enigmatic. I can't understand it. I can't grasp it and lay hold of it. And we saw even in chapter 1, he turns to try to figure this out with wisdom. He says in verse 1, chapter 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. And he comes to the conclusion that, behold, all is vanity. Everything that he has done, everything that he has seen and experienced under the sun is vanity. And we said that this under the sun is a key for us. This is life as we experience it on earth as humans. In many ways, our search for meaning and purpose without reference to God. This idea of life under the sun. And so he's pursuing it. He says, no matter how hard I try, there are some things, verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. He says there are some things that are just broken and missing, and I can't figure out how to fix it. You can hear his frustration. In verse 16, I said in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were before me. My heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I perceived that this also is a striving after the wind. Solomon would say that information doesn't equal transformation. You can have all the information and not matter, and not actually transform you into what we are meant to be. He says all of this leads to vexation and sorrow. That's just chapter 1. He's setting the table for us. But he doesn't stop asking the hard questions. He goes through pleasure, and we looked at that last week. And then he comes again now, chapter 2:12. He says, so I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly. Now, he's already said he's done that. You see what he's doing here? He turns once again to wisdom. He's like, okay, anybody ever lost your keys or your phone? You know that experience where you're like, wait, maybe they were here, and you go to look. So I have a leather satchel that I carry around. It's got my laptop and books, and I usually throw my keys, especially my work keys, in there. And every now and then I'll misplace them, right? And I search that satchel, and it's got like 4 or 5 zippers. It's got pockets, and I'll empty that thing out, and they're not in there. And I'll trace my steps. Maybe it's on my bedside. Maybe it's in the car. Maybe it's in my office. I'll go all those things, and I won't find them. And you know where I'll go look again? I'll go back to that satchel. I'm like, maybe they're in here. Maybe I missed them the first time, right? This is where I normally put them. This is where they should be. And so I go back like a fool looking for something where I know it's not. I've already turned that thing inside out, but I will go again to try to satisfy my mind. And this is what he's doing. He's like, listen, Okay, folly, stupidity, madness, I kind of knew, like we expect that to not be where your keys are. But wisdom, surely this is where I should find the meaning of and purpose of life. Surely it's in wisdom that it can be found. He says, who can do, for what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what's already been done. Nobody is going to outdo what I've already done. The searcher is looking and examining what he has before. His reasoning for reconsidering is to make sure life is considered from every conceivable angle. He's leaving no stone unturned. Who could add to the experience of Solomon? He's the ultimate test case. He had no barriers to go out and find. We're limited, right? I'm not independently wealthy. I have limits on what I can do. Solomon, from a human perspective, had no limits. He had all the brakes taken off. And he says, this was vanity. Now we get a little bit of glimmer of hope here. We realize as we start to move into the book, we'll actually get a mention of God and God's perspective here. We'll start to get more of that as we move into the other chapters. But we start to finally get a little bit of a glimmer of hope because this has been pretty hopeless so far these few weeks. He says there in verse 13, I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly or foolishness. There is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And so he says wisdom is a better place. He says perhaps it's true that wisdom isn't unable to solve everything. Perhaps it is limited. Perhaps it's true that it does add vexation and sorrow. The more I know, the more sorrowful I become. He says, but all things being equal, a life of wisdom is better. It is somewhat advantageous. Wisdom doesn't simply give light, and it enables us to see. It's not just illumination, but it's vision. He says it's better to walk around with your eyes in your head. I think it was Martin Luther said, it's better to walk around with your eyes in your sockets than in your pockets. And I like a rhyme. It helps me remember things. It is better to be able to see with the lights on. You're not going to stumble as much. You're not going to shipwreck your life as much. And so he says, wisdom is useful. It gives us a perception of life, particularly godly wisdom. But the wisdom that he's wrestling with here is a worldly kind of wisdom. We'll look at that more in a second. He says the fool has darkness, not just around him, but the darkness that he's referring to is inside of him. He has no eyes to see. He has no vision to see. There's a darkness that resides within him. Solomon, who wrote some of the Proverbs, he knows this, right? As we look at this, he says that a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. I hope mothers aren't sorrowful this morning. It's often been said, right, that you're only as happy as your most miserable kid. And we know that as parents, that is true. When our kids are burdened, when our kids are carrying hard things or going through difficult times, it's hard for us to be gladdened of heart. And he knows that. He says a foolish son brings sorrow to his mother and his father. He says the wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin. These are just principles that are true, right? We know this to be true. You probably have people in your own life now that you can think of that fit into these categories, right? People who that's a person I admire. They have lived wisely in their life, and while it hasn't gone perfect and their life isn't perfect, it certainly is a better life that I would aspire to than, and we all know people who have ruined their life because of foolish and unwise decisions. He says this burden, even wisdom is limited. Even wisdom isn't giving me all the answers that I'm searching for. He says, I perceived the same event happens to all of them, both the wise and the fool. What's the same event? Death. Psalm 49:10 says, even the wise die. In Greg Easterbrook's book, The Progress Paradox, he says, even though our lives are consistently improving in material terms, do you know that we've halved the global poverty rate in the last 25 years? In just the last 25 years, we've cut global poverty in half. That's incredible. Like, progress is being made, and while we're not there yet, like we've lifted millions of people out of poverty globally. And yet, it doesn't seem like we are getting any happier as a people. Mental health, anxiety, depression, all of those statistics are through the roof. Sooner or later, we realize that we will breathe our last breath, that no matter how wise we live, our life will end. This is what Solomon is realizing. I can't beat this. And not just dead, but forgotten. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre says, life has no meaning the moment you lose the illusion of being eternal. The moment you realize that your life will eventually end, this illusion of your life having meaning, he would say, is gone. Now, he comes from a very different perspective than we would. But you can hear the despair there, right? Death is this kind of great equalizer. And we're not just dead, we're forgotten. Remember a couple weeks ago, we asked how many people knew their great-grandfather's name? And a lot of us did. How many of us knew their great-great-grandfather's name? And hardly anyone in here did. And certainly the next generation, none of us could. Like our own family, we won't even remember. Alexander the Great learned this lesson from his friend Diogenes, who was standing in a field, and he was looking at this pile of bones. And Alexander asked him what he was doing, and he says, I'm searching for the bones of your father Philip, but I can't seem to distinguish them from the bones of the slaves. Death is the great equalizer that will come for all of us, and this is the weight that the preacher is feeling. He can't wisdom his way out of this. And look at the despair that starts to befall him in some ways. In verse in 16, he says, for the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life. I hated life. You ever felt that way? You ever had a season of hating life? Just despair? We mentioned a couple weeks ago, we could list a whole list of people that most people, let's say, would probably envy their life. Robin Williams, Marilyn Monroe, Kurt Cobain, Alexander McQueen, Ernest Hemingway, Vincent van Gogh, David Foster Wallace, Chester Bennington. Like, what do all those people have in common? They all took their own life. They hated life so much that they would end it. You can actually go, there's a website that will continually update and list famous people who have ended their own life. And that list is full of athletes, actors, models, artists, great thinkers, authors, playwrights, statesmen. All coming to the same conclusion. That all of their fame, all of their power, all of their art that they've put out in the world, in the end, wasn't enough. And so we begin to understand that if all of our days are only blessings and pleasures, it's going to tempt us to maybe dismiss some of Solomon. We want to kind of, no, hey, have greater faith here. And yet Solomon won't let us do that. He looks down the barrel of life and he's honest about what he sees. Zach Eswine in his book on Ecclesiastes has some great thoughts on this. He says that when we look at books of wisdom, of which Ecclesiastes is included, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, God gives us categories for faith that include the capacity and the range of emotions and thought. Things like faithful despair, wise hatred, hallowed hollering, and good complaint rise to become our mentors. You ever put those words together? Is there such a thing as faithful despair? Is there such a thing as wise hatred? We're going to see next week, Psalm would say there's a time for hate. Now, this is important that we sift this out, lest we're not confused. To begin, the preacher says he hates life. He doesn't hate God. He's careful not to go that far. And we'll see at the end, his conclusion is to recognize God as the only way that we actually have meaning, right? We have to have a vision that goes beyond the sun. So he's describing life under the sun. But this means the existence, the character, the communion that we experience with God has to form our reference point for our thoughts and words. And with that in mind, we see Solomon being very clear and very honest about the way the world is. We know that Solomon is trying to help us, he's trying to help us contemplate God throughout this book. That'll become more clear as we move through. It's been pretty bleak the first couple chapters. But over 30 times in these 12 chapters, he's going to exalt God as our creator, as our gift giver, as the one who provides joy and enjoyment for us, the one who sustains our life, who gives us wisdom, as redeemer, as judge. And he wants us, as we hear this message, he wants us to contemplate God. And even this statement of him hating life reminds us then of what John Calvin once said, as he was reminded. He says, we're prompted by our own life to contemplate the good things of God. And we cannot seriously aspire to him before we begin to become displeased with ourselves. There's something about us having to be displeased with ourselves that will turn us to contemplate God. Sometimes, in fact, it's faith itself that encourages our voices to utter our displeasures, our aches. We read the book of Job. Job is hating life, but he's hating life before God. We're told that we can cast our cares upon God. Why? Because he cares for us, 1 Peter 5. What does it mean to cast your cares upon God? It means we have to be honest about those things, right? You hear Solomon casting his hatred, his frustration with life. Romans 8 says, in our groanings too deep for words, the Spirit too groans, and he helps us in our weakness. You had that dark night of the soul, hard to articulate even your frustrations. It's just a deep groaning. And Paul says that's where the Spirit meets us, and he groans with us. He prays on behalf of us. You think as parents, right, and as we even think about mothers this morning, if a child believes that their parent can't handle their questions, can't handle their honesty, they'll pretend that everything is well, right? I'm good, I'm fine. But we don't want our kids doing that, do we? We want our kids to be honest about where they are, what they feel, what's going on in their life. We want a parent that has kids that we as parents need to have a capacity for them to be honest, that they'll risk, that they'll argue, that they'll ask, that they'll learn, that they'll cry in our presence as we work through these things together. And this is what God our Father wants from us. God holds us together even when we feel the hatred of life, when we feel vexed. And so the wise begin to learn not to fear what is our true emotions before God, but that it's God's character, His covenant to us that becomes our anchor, that we're able to make every feeling, every thought, no matter how beautiful or grateful or how raw, all of these things then become a matter of prayer for God to enter into, for us to enter into the presence of God with. And so the preacher simply he plainly speaks to us, to God, without any kind of denial, without any kind of icing on top, without any kind of manipulation, pretense. I hated life. But God can handle him saying this. And his whole life doesn't rise and fall on this one sentence or season. No doubt, we've seen already that he's experienced great pleasure as he's tried to pursue that. But when he comes to the end of it, here he is with this sentence on life. But he lets it rest on who God is. He doesn't try to sugarcoat it. He lets it rest on God's character and God's history towards Solomon and his people. And so it is as God relates to us. Those that are wise then learn not to kind of manage life by trying to frantically hold all the broken pieces together. He's already said what is broken can't be made straight. There's things that are missing that can't be found. But we gather all these pieces together and we bring them before God. We're not naive. In Ireland, where I've lived a good chunk of my life, when you ask somebody how they're doing, I would say 95% of the time they answer with the same thing. Oh, I'm grand. I'm grand. Everybody's grand. It's probably, we don't use that maybe language here, but it's the same for us. Hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm good. It's just this knee-jerk reaction. I'm good. I'm fine. Everything's great. Nothing to see here. And yet God wants us to come in our honesty. The preacher is mentoring us into a life that places God at the center of everything eventually, even our frustration, even our hatreds. But the wise, there's a wise hating, right? The wise, the hatred of the wise differs from the kind of foolish ranting kind of hatred of the fool. Hatred comes in many forms, but the wise have a discerning kind of palate for their hatred, if you will. Notice what he says, why he actually hates life in verse 17. He says, so I hated life. Why? Because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the wind. This word grievous is this idea of like, it's severe. It's evil. The world is evil. And he says that which is done under the sun is worthy of his hatred. It's worthy of his sorrow. It's worthy of his tears. The reality that everything is worn out, that creation itself is groaning along with our aching, that human search for gain or for profit in alcohol, in nature, in laughter, in sex, in work, in affirmation, in music, in money, all the things that we looked at last week, he says, all of those things, I come to the end of them and they become a grievousness to me. The condition of the things is what he hates. And so he's not describing some kind of depression here. Some people hate life and want to die, even in the scripture, right? Elijah wants to die because he's exhausted. He's experienced all kinds of trauma, fear, that he was despised and he was the only one left. Right? He was succumbing to, his hatred was based in self-pity. What he needed was some rest. He needed a nap. He needed some food. He needed to be reminded that God still cared about him. That's a different kind of hatred than what Solomon's describing. Jonah wanted to die because God called him to preach, and his hatred was rooted in anger that was eating him up. He would rather drown than change. He hated the people that God was sending him to with the message that he was being sent with. Job, too, knows what it is to hate life, wishing that God would just let him die. His hatred is rooted in painful loss and constant suffering. But these aren't the kind of hatred that Solomon is describing. Solomon isn't just grieving due to a spiritual hardness or self-pity or terrible loss, any of these things. He's describing when he says he hates life. He hates it because of the miserable state that he sees the world operating in. The Westminster Catechism describes it this way. In this world under the sun there exists blindness of mind, a reprobate sense, strong delusions, hardness of heart, horror of conscience, and vile affections, along with other evils that befall us in our bodies and our estates, relations and employments, together with death itself. This is what he hates. This is what he looks around and sees. Beyond the facade of all of his pleasures, beyond the facade of a worldly even kind of wisdom, although he says that's better than living like a fool, it's still in the end is broken. This is the kind of hatred he has. This is the kind of wise hatred that we enter into. We hate that what God has created and called good has become no longer fit for use. The wise can't pretend that all is good. So when Solomon teaches us that there is a time to hate, we'll see that next week, he means that it is right and good to cultivate this kind of distaste for misery and sin and death and the evil that he sees in the world. It's what you feel when you turn the news, or at least when I turn the news on, and story after story, there's just a vexation in your soul. And you hate it. The psalmist knows this. O you who love the Lord, hate evil. To love the Lord with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind and our strength is, by definition, to hate the things that God hates. This is what Solomon is recognizing. He hates the way the world is broken, the way that there are things that are missing that can't be found. The vanity, the vaporousness of life. The world groans. Not only because of others, but also because of us. It is us. It is our own brokenness. It is our own sin. I don't need to watch the news. I just look in the mirror and see things that I know are broken and missing and that I hate. And not in a self-pity, self-loathing kind of way, but just in I can't wait to be made whole again. In contrast to the preacher, the fool teaches us to hate individual people, to hate wisdom, to hate love, wise correction, truth, beauty, knowledge. Just read through Proverbs. You get these descriptions of what the fool is like, who in the end even hates it won't even acknowledge that there's God. This is a description of the fool. But this kind of wisdom that Solomon is operating with, he realizes is still limited. Though it's better than pleasure, that it's better than being foolish, it's better than might, it's no savior. It won't answer his questions. It won't provide for him the meaning that he's looking for. It won't ease his disappointment. And so through the preacher, God is teaching his people and us that we live in the same world as everybody else. That we are now east of Eden, as it were. We'll look at more of this idea of wisdom as we move through the book. But James tells us there's different kinds of wisdom, isn't there? We find different kinds of wisdom. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. There's a worldly wisdom, and then there's a wisdom that we have from above. What we get the description here is this kind of worldly wisdom that just doesn't satisfy. It's not answering his questions any longer. So then he turns to work. He turns to his toil as he describes it. Verse 18, he says, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be a master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. It's vanity. He turns to his work and he says this too is vaporous. It's easy sometimes, if we're not careful, to be defined by our work, isn't it? That's why we ask that question when you first meet somebody. What's one of the first things you ask them? What do you do? Right? What do you do? You know, what are you contributing into the world? What have you given your life to? What level of education, or where do I place you socioeconomically? Like, we get all these kind of like, what do you do? Work in the wrong place is the wrong place to try to find meaning in your life, right? Even good work. It's not the place that we are meant to find our identity and our purpose. Right? You might, I have a good job. Like, I'm actually contributing. I'm a doctor. I'm like saving people's lives. I'm like, this is good work to be done. And that's true. It is good work to be done. Work is not a result of the fall. We were put in a garden and given work even before sin entered the world. So work is from God, we'll see. But it's not meant to be how we find our purpose and our meaning and our identity. Right? Even for pastors. I'm saving eternal lives. Take that, doctors. Right? No, but this isn't the place that I'm meant to find my identity, but how many pastors, how many public pastors have fallen because of that? And so Solomon gives us kind of two problems of work according to this passage. One, he says, firstly, someone else is going to profit from all your hard work. You can't take it with you. He says you can't take it with you. And he goes, and who knows whether the person coming behind you will be a wise or a fool? This idea of who knows, it's like no one knows. No one knows. I don't know if maybe Solomon had an inkling of what was coming in his life, because Solomon was one of the world's most successful business people, one of the most successful leaders, and yet his son, when he becomes king, loses 10/12 of everything that Solomon built. Solomon reigns over 40 years of peace, and within a year of Rehoboam taking the throne, they're at war. He says, and even if they are wise, well, they didn't earn it. They didn't build this, I did. The great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, he has the same experience. He writes this. He says, my question, that which at the age of 50, I'll be 50 in a couple months, brought me to the verge of suicide was the simplest of questions, okay? So here's him. He's like, it brought me to hating life, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man, a question without an answer to which one cannot live. And it was this, he says, what will come of what I am doing today or tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? It can be expressed thus, is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? Those are some questions to be wrestled with. and one that, if we're honest, we're all wrestling with or trying to ignore. Try to self-medicate, try to entertain ourselves with, but there's a reason that he's 50 and asking these questions, because they can only be avoided so long. There's this thing known as a midlife crisis for a reason. I didn't ask these questions in my 20s. I didn't ask them in my 30s. I started thinking about them a little bit in my 40s. The second problem, he says, with work then, he says work itself is toil and trouble. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, all of his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is a vanity. If you've worked for any length of time, this resonates, doesn't it? You ever been anxious, maybe especially if you're self-employed, you ever been anxious that you're not going to have enough work to support yourself? That's a real anxiety. Or anxious that you have too much work that you can't get it all done? Everyone's like, oh, yeah. That's probably most of our problem, right? The hamster wheel never stops. And then you get to clock out, you go home, maybe relax, try to enjoy your family, get in bed, and you can't sleep. Why? Because you're thinking about your work. Even the Apostle Paul wasn't immune from this. He says he loses sleep thinking about ministry and the people that he was trying. His heart was heavy. And so when we make work our life, boy, is it a disappointment. It's a good thing. It's good to work. It's good to have a good work ethic, good to provide, good to have all of these things. But when it's your ultimate, when it becomes an idol in our life, when it's how we identify, it's how we see us getting value and purpose and identity in our life, it leaves us empty. Warren Schmidt learned this lesson in the 2002 film About Schmidt. After retirement, Schmidt looks back on his life. He lived his life as an actuary for Omaha Insurance Company, and he realizes that he's done little or nothing to show for his hard work. And so he wants to try to right that wrong, and so he sponsors a needy child in Africa. And he writes this letter to the needy child. This is his letter. He says, I know we're all pretty small in the big scheme of things, but I suppose the most you can hope for is to make some kind of difference. But what kind of difference have I made? What in the world is better because of me? Once I'm dead and everyone who knew me dies too, it will be as though I never existed. What difference has my life made to anyone? None that I can think of. None at all. Anyway, hope things are fine with you. Yours truly, Warren Schmidt. Imagine some kid in Africa reading this letter, right? He's just grasping at something. He's like, man, he's looking back at his life and going, I've done nothing that's going to last. Maybe charity, right? Maybe some charitable work. What kind of difference have you made? What do we have to show for our work? And the preacher would have given the same answer as Warren Schmidt. When he considered everything that he gained for his labor under the sun, he says, all my days are full of sorrow. All my work is a vexation. And so what is his kind of conclusion as we end to? There is nothing better than for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have any enjoyment? For the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. His description in verse 24, boy, life can be both a vexation and enjoyment at the same time, can't it? It's a mixed bag. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times at the same time. This is our life. But what makes the difference between joy and sorrow? He's starting now to reveal some of the answers to his problem that he's been trying to solve. He'll start to unpack them more clearly as we move through his book. But he says, enjoyment of what God has given us in the simple things like food and drink, even our work, is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have any enjoyment? God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. What makes the difference between joy and sorrow, or joy in sorrow, is the presence of God. Paul tells Timothy this as well. He says, "For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word and through prayer." Everything that God has given us, that he has created, if it's received in a holy way, is good. It's not meant to be rejected. Now, often we take the good things that God has given us, we pervert them, we twist them into something that should be rejected. But if we receive it as God has given it to us, and so Paul would say, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, whatever it is, do it all to the glory of God. So it is with our work. Work is ordained by God in the garden. But it's our rebellion against God that brought the toil of our work. Now our work is by the sweat of our brow. Now our work will work against us. Now it's not just cultivating in the unity and harmony with God in his presence. Now there's a schism. It's broken. Something's lost. Now it will be by the sweat of our brow. And so the way to find pleasure in work is to work as unto the Lord. Is try to recover some of this. This is Paul's instructions to the church at Colossae. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You're serving the Lord Christ. So maybe you don't like your boss. This is a great verse for someone who doesn't like your boss. You go, you know what? You have a boss, and that's who I'm really working for. I know the direct deposit might come from whatever company you work for, post office, whoever you work for. But ultimately, in our mind, it's from the Lord. And so we work for him. We find pleasure as we work for him. We're serving the Lord. Our inheritance will come from him. Notice how the people who please God are described. They're described as having joy. Imagine I gave everyone here a can of peaches. I like canned peaches. But imagine I gave you a can of peaches, and you were like, oh, yes, great. Pie's coming up. I can make a peach pie. Great. But I only gave a third of you can openers. Well, now you're stuck with this can of peaches that you have no access to. It's here. You know it's there. But you can't get into it. You can't access it. And in many ways, this is what the frustration and futility of life is like. There's joy to be had. I can't get to it. God acts as the can opener. He gives us this can opener that we're actually able to access, to get into. He says those apart from God just have the business of gathering and collecting. It's just raw consumerism. It's just trying to get what you can in this life and try to be satisfied with it in some way. So how do we overcome this bitterness of death, this bitterness of striving in our toil? Well, the only way out of this hatred of life is to find wisdom that comes outside of it. It's the same kind of answer we've been looking at the last couple of weeks. It's to look for wisdom above the sun, for a source of joy and purpose and meaning beyond pleasure, beyond our work, even beyond our earthly kind of common sense and wisdom and the best way we can figure out, the best minds together that we can think of how to organize our life. Even that hasn't been able to solve our problems. We're still at war. We still hate our neighbor. The only way out of it is through Christ himself. Paul writes in Colossians 3, if then you have been raised with Christ, those of us that are followers of Jesus, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. He would say, not on things that are under the sun. It's a different shift of mindset. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. In that same book, he says he's encouraging them that their hearts might be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge, wisdom, understanding, knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ. Christ is the key to all of this. In whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. He says, I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. The world has plausible arguments, but they're delusions in the end. It is Christ is the key to our wisdom, to our knowledge, to our happiness, and to our joy. And this word hidden that he uses in both of these here doesn't mean concealed. It's not hidden away like you can't see it. It means protected. It comes from the same Greek word that we get our word encryption from. You are encrypted in Christ. You are protected in Christ. It is he who brings life beyond the sun, so that even when we're dead and gone and forgotten here, your names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life and will never be forgotten. Graven on his heart, we sung this morning. On his hands. And with this perspective of knowing the Creator, we have no fear of death. You don't have to hate life. Life doesn't have to be filled with worry and anxiety and a vexation over our work. Work just gets to be work. It's good. It provides us the gifts then that we get to enjoy. Dwelling places, food, drink, hospitality. And so if you're afraid of death this morning, if you feel a hatred of just the frustration of life welling up within you, of worry, of anxiety, of exhaustion of your toil, just the vanity of existence, the scriptures would tell us to look beyond the sun. Look to the sun, S-O-N. And then we get to eat and drink and find enjoyment in this earth. Jesus says, I've come to give you life to the full. Life overabundant, an abundant life, not just in the afterlife, but now, here, presently. The key to that is receiving that as from the Lord, is that we're working unto the Lord. All of these things make sense when we are in right relationship and right reference to God. And apart from Him, everything becomes futile. Everything is a grind. We eventually end up hating our life in all of the wrong ways. We get to eat and drink and find enjoyment in Him. It's why I think the Lord gives us remembrance in communion, right? We get to eat, we get to drink in remembrance of Him. It's this communion that we get to have with Him. It's a foreshadowing of what will come as we get to enjoy the marriage supper with the Lamb for eternity. If we will turn and find our satisfaction in Him and Him alone. Let me pray for us. We're going to continue to unpack these themes. In many ways, this has been an introduction to the book. We get a lot of the problems. We'll start to move into more and more of the solutions in the weeks to come.